For more than a century, the story of the Vikings felt settled. Scandinavian warriors, Norse blood, blonde hair catching the wind on longship prows. The image was so vivid, so complete, that textbooks printed it as fact. Museum exhibits reinforced it. Television turned it into spectacle. And somewhere beneath the drama, an assumption hardened into certainty that to be a Viking was to carry a specific bloodline from a specific corner of Northern Europe. Then, in 2020, a team of geneticists cracked open the bones, and what they found inside rewrote almost everything. This is not a story about what we discovered. It is a story about what we were wrong about, and why we were wrong about it for so long. The old picture of the Vikings was not built on ignorance. It was built on real evidence, just interpreted through a narrow lens. The sagas described warriors from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Archaeological digs across a century unearthed graves rich with distinctly Nordic weapons, brooches in Scandinavian styles, longships with clinker-built hulls. When skeletons were found alongside swords, they were catalogued as male warriors. When graves contained Scandinavian artifacts, the dead were recorded as Scandinavian. The logic seemed airtight, and for a long time, the physical sciences appeared to confirm it. Early osteological studies, those limited to measuring bone dimensions and estimating sex from pelvic shape, broadly supported what the artifacts already suggested. The Viking world was Scandinavian, and Scandinavian meant something specific: a people, a look, a genetic lineage. This view had deep roots. In the late 19th century, rising nationalist movements across Northern Europe seized on the Vikings as ancestral proof of racial superiority. The horned helmet, itself a fiction, became a symbol. The blonde warrior became an icon. And though serious scholars pushed back against the worst of these distortions, the underlying assumption that Viking identity was fundamentally ethnic proved remarkably difficult to dislodge. It sat in the background of every excavation report, every museum label, every reconstruction drawing. Not because anyone was lying, but because nobody had the tools to ask the right question. What if the bones could speak for themselves? For decades, ancient DNA was a tantalizing concept trapped by technical limitations. The problem was simple but brutal. DNA degrades. In most bones, after 1,000 years in the ground, the vast majority of recoverable genetic material belongs not to the human who once lived, but to the bacteria, fungi, and soil microbes that colonized the skeleton after death. Researchers would drill into a femur or a rib, extract what they could, and find that often less than 1% of the DNA was actually human. It was like trying to read a book after 99% of the pages had been replaced with blank paper. Then came a quiet revolution. Researchers at institutions including the Australian National University and later Harvard Medical School discovered that one particular bone in the human body resists this degradation far better than any other. The petrous bone. It sits deep inside the skull, a small pyramid-shaped formation that protects the inner ear. It is the densest bone in the human body, so dense that under the right conditions, it preserves endogenous DNA at concentrations up to 100 times higher than softer skeletal elements. This was not a marginal improvement, it was a transformation. Suddenly, remains that had yielded nothing useful for decades could be sequenced. Teeth and petrous bones from Viking-era graves, some of them excavated in the 1800s and sitting in museum drawers ever since, became readable. Eske Willerslev, a geneticist at the University of Copenhagen and a fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge, assembled a team to exploit this breakthrough on an unprecedented scale. Over 6 years, they collected samples from more than 80 archaeological sites scattered across Northern Europe, the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, Estonia, Ukraine, Poland, and Russia. The ambition was staggering. Not a handful of genomes, not a regional snapshot. A panoramic view of the Viking world, written in molecular code. The team sequenced the whole genomes of 442 individuals. Men, women, children, even infants, extracted from their teeth and petrous bones, then compared against a genetic database containing thousands of modern individuals. The results arrived in waves, and almost none of them matched what the textbooks said. Before we see what this evidence reveals, if you're finding this discovery as fascinating as we are, subscribe so you don't miss future stories like this one. The first shock was pigmentation. The iconic image, the fair-haired, blue-eyed raider, was statistically wrong. Viking-Age Scandinavians had, on average, darker hair than people living in the same regions today. Brown and black hair were common. The blonde stereotype, it turned out, described modern Scandinavia better than it described the Viking Age itself. But the hair was just the surface. Beneath it lay a far deeper disruption. The genomes showed massive gene flow into Scandinavia from outside, and it was happening before the Viking Age even began. DNA from Southern Europe, DNA from Western Asia, DNA from the Eastern Baltic. These were not faint traces. They represented significant ancestral contributions that reshaped the genetic landscape of Scandinavia in the centuries leading up to the Great Expansion. The Vikings did not sail out from a genetically sealed homeland. They sailed out from a place that was already a crossroads. And here is where the story turns. On the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland, archaeologists had long known about a cluster of Viking-era burials. The graves at sites including Bucquoy and Birka contained swords, shields, and other artifacts unmistakably Scandinavian in style. For over a century, the individuals buried there were categorized as Viking settlers or raiders. The logic, again, seemed obvious. Scandinavian grave goods meant Scandinavian people. When Willerslev's team sequenced the DNA from those Orkney skeletons, the results were not ambiguous. They were absolute. Two of the individuals buried with Viking swords in Viking-style graves carried 0 Scandinavian DNA. Their genomes matched the genetic profile of the Picts, the Celtic-speaking people indigenous to Scotland. These were local men, buried in the full regalia of a culture that supposedly conquered them. As Daniel Lawson at the University of Bristol put it, individuals with 2 genetically British parents had received Viking burials in Orkney and in Norway. This was not cultural exchange at the margins. This was identity adoption at the core, and it worked in both directions. The team found individuals buried in Scandinavia itself whose genomes revealed Irish and Scottish parentage. Several people interred as Vikings in Norway were genetically identified as Sami, an indigenous group with closer genetic ties to East Asian and Siberian populations than to Europeans. The burial said Viking. The DNA said otherwise. What the evidence showed, precisely and repeatedly, was that Viking identity was not a matter of blood. It was social. It was cultural. It was, as archaeologist Kat Jarman observed, something you could become. The swords, the ships, the burial rites, these were markers of belonging to a way of life, not proof of descent from a particular gene pool. What this rules out is equally important. It eliminates the model of the Vikings as an ethnically coherent expansion, a pure Nordic population radiating outward. The genetic data is incompatible with that story. The diversity within Viking communities was too high, the presence of non-Scandinavian DNA in explicitly Viking contexts too frequent, the gene flow too multi-directional. And what it implies about the Viking world is perhaps most striking of all. This was a society capable of absorbing people from radically different genetic backgrounds and granting them full social status, including elite warrior burial. That requires not just tolerance but institutional flexibility, systems of allegiance, adoption, and integration that operated independently of lineage. But if Viking identity could be joined, what did the actual expeditions look like from the inside? The answer came from a place no one expected. In 2008, workmen digging cable trenches near the village of Salmi on the island of Saaremaa struck bone. At first, locals assumed they were Second World War remains. They were not. Archaeologists, led by Juri Peets of Tallinn University, uncovered 2 ships, one small, one large, containing the remains of 41 men killed in battle. The ships dated to around 750 CE, roughly 50 years before the famous Lindisfarne raid that traditionally marks the start of the Viking-Age. The larger ship, Salmi II, was approximately 17 meters long. It contained 34 warriors stacked in multiple layers, alongside more than 40 swords, 91 arrowheads, 251 gaming pieces carved from whalebone and walrus ivory, and the remains of 6 ritually sacrificed dogs. Isotope analysis of the teeth pointed to Sweden's Mälaren Valley as the men's homeland. Then, the DNA results arrived. 4 of the men, laid side by side in the ship, were full biological brothers. A 5th was likely their uncle. These were not strangers assembled for a raid. This was a family, sailing together, fighting together, dying together on a foreign shore. The rest of the ship's occupants came from the same small region, possibly the same village. This was a community expedition, not an anonymous warband. And yet, the broader study revealed that such tight kinship was local. Across the Viking world as a whole, the genetic picture was one of fragmentation, not unity. Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish populations remained remarkably distinct from each other throughout the Viking Age. There was no pan-Scandinavian melting pot. The isolation was such that the team could genetically distinguish a Norwegian individual from a Swede, from a Dane. Only certain coastal trading hubs showed significant internal mixing. This finding complicates the story further. The Vikings were simultaneously more diverse than we thought, in terms of who could become Viking, and more divided than we thought, in terms of the genetic structure within Scandinavia itself. Not every scholar agrees on what this means. Some, like Willerslev, emphasize the radical social openness implied by the Orkney findings. Others urge caution, noting that a Pictish man buried with a Viking sword might have been an enslaved individual given a ritual burial, not a welcomed equal. The DNA cannot distinguish between integration and subjugation. A genome tells you where someone's ancestors came from. It does not tell you whether that person was free. The question of women adds another layer of uncertainty. The study found that female arrivals from the eastern Baltic, and, to a lesser degree, the British and Irish Isles, drove much of the non-Scandinavian gene flow into Viking-era Scandinavia. Whether these women migrated voluntarily, as traders or settlers, or were brought involuntarily, as captives in a society where slavery was endemic, remains an open question the DNA alone cannot resolve. And then there is Birka. In 1878, archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpa excavated a burial chamber in the Viking-era trading town of Birka, on the island of Björkö in Lake Mälaren, Sweden. The grave, catalogued as BJ 581, was extraordinary. It contained a sword, a spear, a shield, armor-piercing arrows, an axe, a battle knife, 2 sacrificed horses, and a gaming board with a full set of pieces, the kind used to plan military strategy. Out of over 1,100 graves at Birka, only 2 contained such a complete arsenal. For over a century, the occupant was listed in every textbook as a high-ranking male warrior. In 2014, bioarchaeologist Anna Kjellström at Stockholm University re-examined the pelvic bones and mandible. The dimensions matched those typical of a woman. The finding was presented at a conference but gained little traction. Some archaeologists questioned whether the bones had been mislabeled during the 19th century excavation. So in 2017, Charlotte Hedenstierna Jonsson of Uppsala University and her colleagues extracted DNA from a tooth and an arm bone. The results were unambiguous: 2 X chromosomes, no Y chromosome. The skeleton was biologically female. The bones had been individually labeled BJ 581 in India Inc. by Stolpa himself, and cross-referencing confirmed no mix-up had occurred. The most revealing warrior grave at Birka, The textbook example of a Viking military elite burial belonged to a woman. As Hedenstierna Johnson noted, no one had contested the warrior interpretation until the skeleton proved to be female. So, where does this leave us? The picture that emerges from ancient DNA is not a simple revision. It is a fundamental reframing. The Vikings were not a people. They were a phenomenon, a cultural, economic, and military system that drew in participants from across a genetically diverse world and bound them through shared practice, not shared ancestry. The word Viking-Ar itself, from Old Norse, meant something closer to pirate or raider. It described what you did, not who you were. Today, 6% of the UK population carries detectable Viking DNA. In Sweden, the figure is 10%. But only 15 to 30% of modern Swedes share direct ancestry with the individuals who lived in the same Swedish regions 1,300 years ago. The genetic churn since the Viking-Age has been enormous. The past is not a stable platform beneath us, it shifts. And on the island of Saaremaa in Estonia, 2 ships still lie beneath the ground near a village schoolhouse, 200 meters from the present coastline, buried under sand and centuries. Inside one of them, 4 brothers from central Sweden rest where they fell, side by side, in a battle that happened before the Viking Age is supposed to have begun. Their swords were deliberately bent after death, perhaps to discourage grave robbers, perhaps for reasons we will never understand. If this hidden chapter of history intrigued you, subscribe to explore more mysteries. The evidence is only now revealing. Here is the question that still hangs over all of this. If Viking identity was something you could join, something open to Picts and Sami and people from across Europe, then what exactly drove the expansion? Was it opportunity? Desperation? A system so effective at absorbing outsiders that it grew like a living thing? The DNA has answered the question of who the Vikings were. The question of why, that remains wide open. What do you think pulled people into the Viking world? Was it the promise of wealth, the pull of belonging, or something we haven't considered yet?